Hi everybody, and welcome to my second of three videos on this, the Minolta Alpha 9. In the first video we looked at what all the buttons were. In this video we're going to talk about what all of them do, and then in the third video we'll talk about the custom functions menu and how to set all of those and what all of the custom functions are. So let's start off with pretty basic. We're going to show you how to mount and unmount the lens. To remove a lens, you simply push the lens release there and twist it that way, which is counter or anti-clockwise, and remove. To put the lens back on, you find the red dot on the lens and the red dot on the flange, not coincidence. Line them up and turn it clockwise. And if your camera's on, the autofocus will engage and pull the lens back to near infinity focus. I'm going to turn the camera off for a minute. Let it go back to infinity focus. Loading and unloading film is pretty easy. To load film, all you have to do is open up the film back. We're going to grab our film and drop it in. Drop it in. There we go. Got to angle it in that way. We're going to pull out the leader until the leader aligns with the orange dot. Close the film back. Turn on the camera if it's not already on. And it'll automatically advance to the point that the film is ready to start taking pictures. And I don't think I'm going to be able to show you this camera in action with the back open, but let's find out. Yeah, it's not going to let me. But what happens when you load film, you don't want to open the back of the camera because film is one and done. If it's exposed to light like it is right now, it's ruined. It won't be able to take any photos. And if there were any photos on it, they're erased. You won't get anything out of them. But what happens is when the camera takes up film, it pulls it through the camera, takes a picture, pulls it to the next frame, pulls it to the next frame, and takes it up on this spool over here. After the film is done, it'll automatically rewind for you, and then you just have to pull the film out of the camera the opposite way of how you put it in. The next thing we'll do is change the battery. That's a good angle. So this camera uses two CR123 batteries. All you have to do to open the battery compartment, this is pretty well designed. This is a battery compartment when it's closed. To open it, you just lift this and turn the dial, and then it's going to pop open. It has a spring in there. Empty out the two used batteries, grab two new ones and drop them in with the plus side towards the bottom of the camera. Don't lock it before you close it. Close it, rotate it to lock it, and now you've replaced the batteries. The camera has the nonsensical Sony hot shoe, but it has a flash sync of 1/300th of a second, which will work with a flash here, as well as one that's connected to the PC port. So if you don't have any Sony flashes, you can use one off-body, any flash off-body through the PC port. Or you can get an adapter that goes from a Sony hot shoe to a standard hot shoe. Usually those electronic contacts don't work, but you can at least then mount a standard flash on here and connect it to the PC port. So let's try to look through the viewfinder here. Here is the camera's viewfinder. This is the standard focusing mat, and let's take a look around it. You can see that there's not a whole lot in here to distract you. And I'm using a new camera to film this batch of videos, and it does not like to show the whole viewfinder. I can't figure out why. But the metering data for this is along the bottom of the viewfinder, and it has all the information you need to know about exposure, shooting mode, shutter speed, aperture, things like that, whether you're over or underexposed. It's a very well designed and thorough layout that's also not invasive to the shooting procedure. Okay, so the camera has three metering modes: spot, full matrix, and center weighted. Right now it is in center weighted, which is signified by two brackets. That is full matrix, and that is spot metering. And the way that they work is that full matrix has 14 metering modes arranged as a honeycomb pattern through the center part of the image. And the auto exposure and the autofocus with matrix are linked. So if you have a subject over here, then it's going to provide the majority of the metering information from the zones over on this side of the frame. So and so it moves based on where the autofocus is set. If you have center weighted, then it's going to use the central. It's going to use all of the metering zones, but the ones in the center bar here will have the most metering data priority. Oops, that's center weighted. That's full matrix. If you use spot, only the very center metering zone will provide any metering data at all. So you can switch between these for different modes. So let's say that this were the photo that we wanted to take. Okay, we've got bright areas here where my hands are, mid-ranges to somewhat darks where the blues are, and then a bunch of blacks where the camera is. So if you were to meter this in matrix mode, it would take data from this entire scene and use it to compile an exposure. And if the autofocus was over here, for instance, then the majority of the metering information would be where my hand is. If we were in center weighted, then it would just use the central metering areas, and the majority of the metering data would come from the center ones right here, with some supporting ones from the metering zones that provide a ring around those central metering areas. In spot metering, only this one right here where the blackest part of the camera is located would be used for metering. And so what would happen is you get three completely different exposures for the same scenes. If in matrix metering, you'd get one where the black areas were really dark and the blue areas were mid-tone, and my hands were probably still fairly white. In center metering, my hands would be completely blown out. The camera would still be pretty dark, and the blues would still be fairly mid-tone. In spot metering, the camera would appear almost gray. The spot meter would expose to make this black area gray. And my hands and then the blue area would be completely blown out as white, because all of the metering data would be coming from the darkest part of the frame. So let's talk about a couple of the other things here on the back. Your AF lock will activate your autofocus, but it will also lock your autofocus once a focus point is checked just by holding it down. Auto exposure lock will lock your exposure so that you can keep the same exposure even if your lighting conditions change. And what that is really helpful for is, let's say that we wanted to take this photo right here. Again, okay, this is really dark. So if we took this photo here, then the background would be fairly blown out, and we don't want that. But if we recomposed so that we got the background here to meter properly, and then we hit the auto exposure lock button, we could recompose the image, holding the auto exposure lock, take the picture, and then the camera would take the picture as though it were metering the blue areas, not the predominantly dark central area. So in real life, let's say you're sitting at a restaurant underneath a shade, and you're outside sitting there, and you're in the shade, you're covered, but behind you is in full sun a scenic view of something or another. You could meter off of that scenic view, recompose, and take a picture and have the person you're there with be somewhat underexposed, unless you use the on-camera flash to illuminate them, and the background then be properly exposed. And that would be a good way to have the person you're with be properly exposed through the use of the flash and auto exposure lock metering to obtain an exposure that will take a picture of the scenery in the background, as well as combining it with the flash to illuminate the foreground, which is in the shadows. On the top, we have some different functions. We have the 4 different shooting modes: program, aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual. Program means the camera's going to do everything for you. It's going to figure out everything that needs to be done in the situation. Shutter speed, aperture, all of that is figured out by the camera. Aperture priority means you select the camera aperture, which you do on camera with one of these 2 dials, depending on what setting you use in the custom settings. We'll see that in video 3. And then the camera will figure out the best shutter speed, and it can use any shutter speed. It could use 1/125th, but it could also use 1/129th or 1/208th, or 1/208.4. The camera's shutter is stepless, so it can pick any shutter speed at once, not just the standard ones that you're able to pick through manual control, which we'll see in a second. S is shutter priority, meaning that you pick the shutter speed, any of the standard shutter speeds, and then the camera will pick the aperture, and it can pick any aperture. It doesn't have to pick f/5.6 or f/8. It can pick f/6.947 if it wants to have the best exposure with the shutter speed you've picked. In manual, you will pick the shutter speed and aperture, and you're limited to the options that it gives you for control in those situations when you use manual. So manual gives you the most control over your setting. Shutter speed is really good if you're doing something like sports where you need to control the way that you freeze motion. It's also really good if you want to have a very long exposure and want to make sure that you get the longest exposure you can with your lens. Aperture priority is my favorite way of shooting because it gives you the most creative control over how the image is going to turn out. And full program is going to take everything away from you, and it's a mode I don't recommend using most of the time. Over here we have the exposure compensation dial. This is really good for things like image bracketing, although there is an option to bracket on the camera. We'll see how to bracket with this camera automatically in a minute. You can manually bracket with your exposure compensation. To adjust your exposure compensation, it should typically be at 0, but you'll slide this lock outward, and now you can adjust your exposure compensation dial to +2 stops or -2 stops, and then lock it so it doesn't adjust. What this means is, let's say you're at 1/125th and f/5/6 at 0. If you go +1 stop, you're going to be at 1/60th and f/5.6. If you go minus a stop, you're going to be at 1/250th and f/5.6. Or the shutter speed will remain the same and the aperture will change depending on your shooting mode. But what this will do is automatically compensate to provide more or less light depending on how you, more is this way, or less light being this way, depending on what you set the compensation dial to. And if you prefer half stop increments, you can do that as well. There are half stop increments available on the other side. All you have to do is rotate the dial. And the camera knows by the dial placement whether you're in third or half stop increments. There's a little switch underneath this dial that allows the camera to know which way it's set. It's really a very nice interface element. Underneath this dial we have the flash exposure compensation dial, and what you can do is reduce the flash power or overclock the flash to give you more or less light when you take a picture using a flash. I tend to just set that at 0. A lot of flashes have the ability for you to control that on the flash body. I tend to control that on the flash body. This is really for use with only a limited number of Minolta and Sony flashes that can read that information from the cameras. Most flashes are not going to be able to communicate with this camera to find out what this is set at, so I tend to just leave that at 0. Over here on this side we have your drive mode. So we have a number of different drive mode options. The red ME stands for multiple exposures. Next to it we have self-timer. We have drive continuous or drive single. This is one shutter button press, one shot. Hold the shutter button, multiple shots. Bracket continuous and bracket single. If you have a 3 or 5 image bracketing pattern set up, let's say you have a 3 image bracketing pattern set up in your camera, you'd have to push the button 3 times to bracket with single or just once with continuous. Those are your drive mode options. The next thing we have is your autofocus modes. We have autofocus and manual focus. Manual lets you manual focus the lens yourself. Autofocus, the camera will do it. If you're in single shot autofocus, it'll focus and keep shooting. If you're in continuous mode, it'll change focus between shots to make sure that the subject, if it's moving, is in focus. And if you're in auto mode, the camera will choose between the two for the proper situation. So there you can see as I moved around, it switched from single to continuous depending on what was needed for the autofocus to take an in-focus image. So with everything we've seen, let's put that all together now and see how to take a photo with the Minolta Alpha 9. So first thing we need to do is turn it on, make sure that it's on. Okay, great, LCD is on. If it's dark outside, let me turn these lights down here. If it's dark outside, you can see, you might have been able to see that the LCD illuminated a little bit right there. So hitting this little switch right back here will allow you to illuminate the LCD if you can't see it. So first thing you're going to do is sight up your subject through your viewfinder. Okay, great. Next thing we want to do is focus. You can either use autofocus or manual. Okay. Assuming we're in aperture priority mode, you want to adjust your aperture to the aperture that you would like for this shot. Let's go with a very shallow depth of field, down to 1.4. There we go, got our shots. Let's try it again, a slightly deeper depth of field at 2.2. Or if you're in shutter priority, you would adjust your shutter speed and the camera would tell you whether or not it can take a photo. And if you can see the blinking 1.4 there, what that means is that the camera lens is not fast enough for the shot. And so the fastest I'm going to be able to go is 1/60th of a second, 1/160th of a second. Anything faster than that and the photo is going to be unexposed when I take it. And you can see that the aperture is adjusted when I when I slow the shutter speed down. Now in manual, I have full control over everything, regardless of whether or not it's actually going to turn out as a competent image. And then in program, the computer's going to, and the camera's going to pick everything for me. So let's leave it on aperture priority mode. Okay. So now we've focused our image, we've got it composed, we're in the correct mode, we're happy with everything. That's how we take a picture. We just push the shutter button and we're good to go. Okay, now that we've seen how to take a single exposure, let's see how to take multiple exposures with this camera. First thing to do is set the drive mode dial to the red ME for multiple exposures. Now the process of it is you just want to compose and you can take literally as many photos as you want. It's going to count up here up to M9, letting you know multiple exposure 9. But once you get up to 9, you can keep going. If you wanted to go to 100 exposures on a frame, you could. You wouldn't get anything from it. When you're done with your multiple exposure, simply switch it to another drive mode. It'll advance the frame. It's not doing anything now because there's no film in it, but it'll advance the frame and your multiple exposure will be over. Now that said, there's a little bit more to the science of the multiple exposure. So let's say that you are taking a picture and your proper exposure is 1/125th at f/5.6. Okay, so you get your settings there, or you're in aperture priority mode. In manual mode, you can either adjust your shutter speed up and down. To do a double exposure, you'd want to go to 1/250th, a triple exposure 1/500th. Every time you increase the number of exposures by 1, you need to cut the amount of light by half. In aperture priority, shutter priority, or program mode, there's a little bit of an easier way to do it, which is to use the exposure compensation dial. So if you have a double exposure, what you want to do is go to -1, half, 1 stop less light. If you're doing a triple exposure, -2, 2 stops less light, and let the camera take care of any of the calculations for you when you're doing your multiple exposure. And that's the process for a multiple exposure. It's pretty simple with these cameras. They're really designed to do those well. So that is it for the second video on the Minolta Alpha 9. Really spectacular and fun to use camera. Very intuitive, very capable. If you are fortunate enough to get one of these, I find it hard to believe that you wouldn't fall in love with it within a roll or two of using it. They're really phenomenal cameras. There are a couple of special features about this camera, one of which is that the 14-zone meter is really advanced, and because it follows around the focus point, it provides very good exposure linked with the autofocus. With the proper data back, you can store EXIF data for your film for up to 7 rolls of 36 exposures in that memory and download them to your computer later. The camera has a stainless steel body, which makes it super strong. It's rare in a camera to see a stainless steel body, but it's strong. It doesn't corrode or rust. It's designed to last for a very, very long time. It is one of the most robust cameras ever made, and the interface on this camera was engineered so that the camera and on-body flash controls could be used without the photographer taking their eye away from the camera. And once you really get to know the layout of this camera, you really, as you can see here are my hands. I can access everything just by holding it. A photographer who knows how to use this camera can use any of the functions on it very easily by touch without removing their eye from the viewfinder, and that is a fantastic benefit to photographers that this camera offers. This is my second of 3 videos. In the next video, we'll go through the custom functions menu, and we will talk about what each of the custom functions does and how it affects the camera's operation. If you have any questions, please leave those below. If this video was helpful, please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that what I'm producing is helpful and useful to you. If you have any thoughts or comments, please leave those in the comment section below. Suggestions for future videos as well. If you'd like to subscribe, please do that, and then you'll know when I have future camera and photography related videos. If you're an amateur photographer who's taken photos with the Minolta Alpha Dynax Maxxum 9, by all means, please leave a link to that album or those albums in the comments. One last thing, thank you guys for watching and take great photos.